There are moments in history where silence itself feels intentional, where records fade, not because time was careless, but because someone chose forgetting over remembrance. The story of the Merovingian bloodline begins in such a silence, not with a battle, not with a coronation, but with a question that lingers unanswered in the margins of medieval history. What truly happened to the first sacred kings of Europe? Official history tells us the Merovingians fell quietly, deposed, tonsured, sent to monasteries, their line extinguished like a candle in a drafty hall. A dynasty replaced, nothing more. And yet, for a family that ruled with near-mythic authority, kings said to be chosen by divine blood, marked by sacred hair, whispered to descend from ancient, even supernatural origins, their ending feels strangely small. Too neat, too final, because powerful bloodlines rarely end. They disperse, they hide, they migrate. This documentary begins not with what we are told, but with what we are not. With the unsettling possibility that the Merovingian story does not conclude in the forests of Francia, nor in the cloisters of forgotten monasteries, but continues far beyond the borders of Western Europe, eastward, along ancient roads few historians dare to follow. To understand why such a journey might have occurred, we must first step into the mindset of the early medieval world. This was not an age governed purely by law or armies, but by belief. Blood was destiny. Lineage was sacred. A king was not merely a ruler, but a vessel of divine favor, cosmic order, and ancestral power. The Merovingians were not just kings, they were different kings. Chroniclers describe them as long-haired rulers whose hair carried mystical significance, cut only in disgrace or defeat. To shear a Merovingian was not just to remove a crown, but to sever a connection between heaven and earth. And that connection made them dangerous. As the Roman Church consolidated its authority, it increasingly found itself uneasy with dynasties that claimed legitimacy independent of papal blessing. The Merovingians ruled not because Rome crowned them, but because they believed their blood ordained them. In a world moving toward centralized spiritual power, such beliefs were intolerable. Sacred kingship had to be replaced with sanctioned kingship, divine blood with holy approval. What followed, at least on the surface, was a political transition. The Carolingians rose, backed by the Church, rewriting the structure of European power. But beneath that surface lies a far more unsettling idea, that the Merovingians did not simply lose power, they lost permission to exist openly. And when powerful families lose permission, they do not vanish. They move. Scattered clues suggest that as the Merovingian grip weakened, something else was happening quietly in the background. Certain noble families disappear from Frankish records without explanation. Royal women vanish entirely, leaving no burial sites, no confirmed fates. Children of the bloodline are mentioned once, then never again. And most curious of all, certain Eastern chronicles, Byzantine, Armenian, Persian, begin to reference foreign nobles of mysterious Western origin appearing at courts far from Francia. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps the faint echo of a journey deliberately erased from Western memory. The idea of an eastward exodus may seem improbable to the modern mind, trained to see medieval Europe as isolated and static. But the early Middle Ages were anything but closed. Trade routes crisscrossed continents. Pilgrims traveled from Gaul to Jerusalem. Merchants carried silk, spices, manuscripts, and secrets along roads older than Rome itself. The East was not distant, it was connected, and it was safer. Beyond the reach of the Roman Church, beyond Frankish politics, beyond the rewriting of genealogies, the East offered something the West no longer could: anonymity for kings and survival for bloodlines. Empires like Byzantium understood the value of royal refugees. So did Persian courts, Caucasus kingdoms, and steppe empires where lineage could be absorbed, disguised, or reborn under new names. If the Merovingians wished to preserve their blood, their knowledge, or their sacred legitimacy, the East was not an escape. It was a strategy. What makes this possibility more compelling is the behavior of later secretive groups who seemed obsessed with Eastern origins. Medieval orders, knightly brotherhoods, and monastic networks would later speak in coded language of lost kings, hidden heirs, and journeys beyond the sunset. Some claimed ancient knowledge preserved not in Europe, but in the lands of sunrise. Others spoke of relics that had traveled east, guarded by bloodlines rather than armies. These were not idle fantasies. They were fragments of memory. Memory, however, is fragile, especially when it threatens authority. Over centuries, Western historians inherited a version of the past shaped by monasteries, courts, and churches that benefited from the Merovingians being remembered as weak, decadent, or irrelevant. The idea that they survived, worse, that they thrived elsewhere, would undermine the legitimacy of every dynasty that followed. It would reopen questions best left closed. Questions about divine right, about stolen crowns, about whether history's winners truly deserve their victory. So the story was flattened, simplified, ended. But history has a habit of leaking through cracks. Symbols reappear where they shouldn't. Royal insignia echo Merovingian designs in distant lands. Legends emerge of Western kings who came from beyond the mountains, carrying strange customs and sacred genealogies. And always, just beneath the surface, is the same unsettling implication. The bloodline did not die. It changed direction. This section is not about proof. Not yet. It is about atmosphere, about preparing the listener to step outside accepted timelines and follow a trail that grows colder the further west one looks, and warmer the further east one dares to go. Because the Merovingians, if they truly believed in the sacred power of their lineage, would never have accepted extinction. They would have chosen survival over spectacle, silence over martyrdom, movement over memory. And so we begin with a whisper, a rumor carried not by chroniclers, but by absence, by the strange feeling that something royal slipped through history's fingers and walked eastward, unseen, unrecorded, but not forgotten. As this journey unfolds, we will follow those whispers through forgotten roads, suppressed texts, hidden kingdoms, and shadowed genealogies, toward a possibility that reshapes early European history entirely. That the Merovingians did not fall. They disappeared. To understand why the Merovingians might have vanished rather than perished, one must first understand who they truly were before history claims they fell. Not the simplified figures presented in schoolbooks, but the deeply symbolic, semi-mythical rulers who stood at the crossroads between pagan antiquity and Christian Europe. Their story does not begin with politics alone. It begins with legend, belief, and a concept of kingship so ancient that even the church struggled to control it. The Merovingian dynasty emerged in a world still echoing with the collapse of Rome. Authority was fragmented, borders were fluid, and power did not yet belong to institutions but to bloodlines. In this landscape, the Merovingians were not merely warlords who seized territory. They were perceived as chosen. Their right to rule was not written on parchment, but believed to be carried in their veins. According to early Frankish tradition, the Merovingian line traced its origins to a mysterious ancestral figure named Merovec, from whom the dynasty took its name. Even Merovec himself exists somewhere between history and myth. Some chroniclers describe him as the son of a Frankish king and a supernatural being encountered in the sea, an origin story deliberately vague, yet powerful in implication. Whether symbolic or literal, such legends served a purpose. They framed the Merovingians as more than human rulers. They were liminal beings standing between worlds. This perception only deepened with Clovis I, the dynasty's most famous king and the man often credited with laying the foundations of medieval France. Clovis is remembered as a conqueror, a unifier of tribes, and a convert to Christianity. But beneath these familiar labels lies a far more complex figure. Clovis did not convert as a submissive act to the church. He converted on his own terms, presenting himself not as a servant of Christian authority, but as a king whose divine favor had merely taken a new form. For the people he ruled, Clovis was not simply baptized, he was transformed. His conversion was framed as a continuation of sacred kingship, not its replacement. The old gods had not vanished. They had been absorbed. This blending of pagan and Christian symbolism became a defining feature of Merovingian rule, and one of the primary reasons the dynasty remained so difficult for Rome to fully control. Central to Merovingian identity was the belief in sacred hair. Unlike later medieval kings who derived authority from coronation rituals, Merovingian legitimacy was physical. Their long, uncut hair symbolized strength, fertility, and divine right. To cut a Merovingian's hair was an act of humiliation equivalent to stripping him of his kingship. This was not metaphor, it was belief. Chroniclers repeatedly describe deposed Merovingians being forcibly shorn before being sent into exile or monastic life, as though their power could be physically removed. This concept of bodily kingship is ancient, predating Christianity by centuries. It echoes practices found among Germanic tribes, Scythian rulers, and even ancient Near Eastern kings. The Merovingians were inheritors of this archaic worldview, one in which kings were living symbols of cosmic order. As long as the bloodline endured, so too did the divine mandate. And this is precisely what made them dangerous. As Christianity spread and institutionalized itself across Europe, it sought to redefine power. Authority was to flow from God through the church to kings, not directly through bloodlines. The Merovingians, however, represented an older order, one that bypassed ecclesiastical approval entirely. Their kings were sacred not because Rome said so, but because they always had been. For a time, this uneasy coexistence worked. Merovingian rulers patronized monasteries, supported bishops, and presented themselves as defenders of the faith. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The church needed kings who could be crowned, disciplined, and replaced. The Merovingians could be none of these things, not without dismantling the myth that sustained them. Despite later portrayals of Merovingian rulers as indolent, do-nothing kings, contemporary evidence paints a different picture. They administered law, commanded armies, managed complex diplomatic relationships, and oversaw a vast territory stretching across modern-day France, Germany, and beyond. The idea that they were weak or incompetent emerges primarily from sources written after their fall, sources aligned with their successors. This is a crucial detail. History is rarely neutral, and dynastic transitions are often accompanied by character assassination. By diminishing the Merovingians, later chroniclers justified their removal. A sacred bloodline, once framed as lazy and ineffective, no longer seemed worthy of survival. Yet even as political power gradually shifted away from them, the Merovingian bloodline itself remained potent. Royal women married into powerful families. Children were born whose ancestry could not be erased, even if their names were removed from records. The dynasty's influence extended quietly through kinship networks that official histories chose not to emphasize. This period, the centuries before the fall, is marked by contradiction. On the surface, Merovingian kings appear to lose authority to mayors of the palace and rising aristocrats. But symbolically, their blood retains its aura. People continue to believe in it. To many, the Merovingians were still the rightful kings, regardless of who held the reins of government. And belief, once established, does not disappear easily. It is during this time that we begin to see the early signs of strategic withdrawal. Power is not always lost violently. Sometimes it is relinquished deliberately, preserved in quieter forms. When a bloodline understands that open rule has become dangerous, survival demands adaptation. The Merovingians were not ignorant of the shifting political winds. They saw the Carolingians rise, backed by papal authority and armed with a new vision of kingship, one rooted in service to the church rather than inherited sanctity. They understood that their worldview was becoming incompatible with the future of Western Europe. What options remained to them? Extinction was one, martyrdom another. But history shows that elite families rarely choose either when alternatives exist. And for the Merovingians, alternatives did exist. Routes, alliances, and traditions that extended far beyond the West. The East, in contrast to Rome's growing dominance, still recognized ancient forms of kingship. Byzantine emperors blended Christian theology with imperial divinity. Persian shahs ruled by cosmic mandate. Caucasian kings traced lineage through myth and legend as much as law. In such places, a sacred bloodline would not be an embarrassment. It would be an asset. Seen through this lens, the Merovingian decline takes on a new character. It begins to resemble not a collapse, but a repositioning, a slow disengagement from public rule, a preparation for disappearance. By the time official history declares the dynasty finished, much of its essence, its blood, its beliefs, its memory, may already have been elsewhere, waiting, preserved. This section, then, is not merely about who the Merovingians were. It is about why they mattered deeply enough to be feared, rewritten, and potentially hidden. Their kingship represented a model of power the medieval world was no longer willing to tolerate, but also not willing to destroy outright. Because destroying a sacred bloodline is dangerous. Far safer to let it walk away. In the ancient world, power was never abstract. It was rooted in land, in rivers and mountains, in crossroads and thresholds where the human and the divine were believed to touch. For the Merovingians, kingship was not only carried in blood, but anchored in geography. Their authority flowed from an intimate relationship with sacred spaces, places charged with memory, myth, and unseen forces. To understand the choices they may have made when their rule came under threat, we must understand how deeply they believed land itself legitimized kings. Long before Christianity reshaped Europe's spiritual map, the peoples of Gaul understood territory as alive. Forests were not empty. Rivers were not inert. Hills, springs, and ancient ruins were believed to hold power accumulated over generations. The Merovingians inherited this worldview and built their rule upon it. They did not merely govern land. They inhabited it in a sacred sense, positioning themselves at nodal points of meaning where authority felt inevitable rather than enforced. This is why Merovingian royal centers often appear in places already ancient when they arrived. Cities like Reims, Paris, Soissons, and Metz were not chosen at random. Many sat atop Roman foundations, Celtic sanctuaries, or prehistoric sites whose significance predated written memory. By ruling from these locations, the Merovingians aligned themselves with continuity, with the idea that power flowed through time, not just through conquest. In this worldview, geography functioned almost like a living map of legitimacy. To control certain places was to inherit their accumulated authority. Sacred springs where kings were anointed, battlefields where ancestors triumphed, burial grounds where royal dead were laid to rest, all formed a network of meaning that bound the dynasty to the land itself. The Merovingians were not interchangeable rulers. They were perceived as belonging to the territory in a way others did not. This belief extended beyond cities and into the invisible architecture of the landscape. Medieval traditions speak of hidden paths, ancestral roads, and alignments that linked sacred sites across vast distances. Long before modern concepts like ley lines entered popular imagination, early Europeans believed certain routes were charged with spiritual significance. Pilgrimage paths, trade roads, and royal itineraries often overlapped, reinforcing the idea that movement itself could be sacred. The Merovingians understood this instinctively. Their power was mobile. Kings traveled constantly, holding court across their realm, renewing bonds between people, land, and bloodline. This mobility was not weakness, it was ritual. By moving through sacred geography, the king activated it, reminding subjects that authority was not confined to a throne room, but woven into the earth beneath their feet. This is where the story begins to widen, because sacred geography does not stop at borders. The ancient routes that crossed Merovingian lands did not end in Francia. They extended eastward, linking Gaul to the Rhine, the Danube, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and beyond. These were not merely trade routes for goods. but arteries of belief, carrying myths, symbols, and royal ideologies across continents. Kings, priests, and pilgrims moved along the same paths, exchanging more than silver and silk. Within this network, geography became a language. Certain landscapes echoed others. Mountains mirrored mountains. Rivers corresponded to rivers. A sacred hill in Gaul could find its spiritual twin in Armenia. A royal sanctuary in Francia might resonate with a temple complex in Persia. To a people who thought symbolically, such correspondences mattered. This raises a crucial possibility that the Merovingians did not see the East as foreign, but as familiar in a deeper, mythic sense. Eastern kingdoms preserved concepts of sacred kingship long abandoned in the West. In Byzantium, emperors ruled as God's representatives on earth, clothed in cosmic symbolism. In Persia, kingship was tied to divine glory, Kavarina, a radiant force inherited through blood. In the Caucasus, royal lines traced ancestry through semi-legendary figures, blending history and myth seamlessly. These societies understood power in ways the Merovingians recognized. Geography, then, offered not just refuge but resonance. When Western Europe began rejecting sacred blood in favor of sanctioned authority, the Merovingians would have felt a rupture, not just politically, but cosmologically. The land that once affirmed their legitimacy was being reinterpreted, stripped of its older meanings, overwritten by new religious structures aligned with Rome. Churches replaced groves. Bishops replaced kings as spiritual intermediaries. The landscape itself was being recoded. In such moments, dynasties attuned to sacred geography do not simply resist. They relocate their center of gravity. History offers many examples of this phenomenon. When religious or political shifts render a land hostile to an older order, elites often migrate toward regions where their worldview still holds meaning. This is not exile, it is realignment. The Merovingians, if they believed their blood required sacred grounding to remain potent, would have sought landscapes that still recognized that truth. The East offered precisely this. Not only political protection, but symbolic continuity. Even the language of later legends hints at this movement. Medieval stories speak of lands of sunrise as places of hidden wisdom and preserved truths. Sacred objects are said to travel eastward when the West grows unworthy of them. Kings disappear into distant realms, awaiting a time of return. These are not random motifs. They reflect a deep cultural memory that when power withdraws, it does not dissolve, it relocates. Maps themselves tell part of this story. Early medieval cartography was not meant to be geographically accurate, but symbolically meaningful. East was often placed at the top of maps, associated with Eden, origin, and renewal. To move east was to move toward beginnings, toward purity, toward divine proximity. A royal journey eastward would not have been seen as flight, but as return. This symbolism matters when considering Merovingian decisions. A dynasty that traced its authority to ancient, even pre-Christian sources may have seen the East not as abandonment of the West, but as preservation of origin, a way to keep the bloodline aligned with the sacred while the West transformed beyond recognition. There are also subtler clues embedded in place names, architectural motifs, and heraldic symbols. Certain Merovingian emblems, bees, lions, solar imagery, reappear in Eastern royal contexts centuries later. While historians often dismiss such parallels as coincidence, symbolic continuity was rarely accidental in pre-modern societies. Symbols were inherited, guarded, and repurposed deliberately. If parts of the Merovingian elite did migrate eastward, they would have carried not just people, but meaning. Sacred stones, relics, stories, rituals, knowledge of places where power could still be anchored in blood and land rather than decree. And perhaps most importantly, they would have carried memory of where they came from and why they left. Sacred geography is not erased easily. Even when names change, roads remain. Even when buildings fall, alignments persist. The earth remembers what people forget. And in certain eastern regions, echoes of Western royal presence surface like fossils. Anomalies that do not fit local genealogies, sudden appearances of foreign nobles with unfamiliar customs and ancient claims. This section does not argue that the Merovingians conquered eastern lands or founded new empires under the same name. That would have defeated the purpose of disappearance. Instead, it suggests something subtler and far more plausible, that they embedded themselves into existing sacred geographies, allowing their bloodline to survive quietly within landscapes that still recognized its meaning. In this sense, geography becomes a form of concealment. By stepping into lands where sacred kingship was normal rather than threatening, the Merovingians could preserve what mattered most without attracting attention. They could become one royal line among many, rather than a dangerous anomaly. Thus, sacred blood found sacred ground. And the journey east, if it occurred, was not random. It followed ancient paths of power, belief, and memory, paths that had existed long before the Merovingians, and would outlast them as well. To follow those paths is to move closer to the truth hidden beneath history's surface. Every age has its quiet revolutions. Not all of them are fought with armies or announced with proclamations. Some unfold in monasteries, in councils, in the careful wording of documents that decide who may rule and who must be forgotten. The fall of the Merovingians belongs to this quieter kind of revolution, one in which power did not simply change hands, but changed meaning. By the 7th century, Western Europe was no longer the fragmented spiritual landscape it had once been. The Roman Church, having survived the collapse of empire, was steadily reconstructing authority in a new form. Bishops replaced governors. Monasteries replaced civic centers. And Rome, once the heart of imperial administration, became the nerve center of moral and political legitimacy. Kings were still needed, but only the right kind of kings. The Merovingians were not that kind. Their authority, rooted in sacred blood and ancestral myth, posed a fundamental problem for the Church's vision of order. Rome sought a hierarchy where power flowed downward, from God to church to king to people. The Merovingians represented an older, more dangerous idea, that power could flow directly from the divine into a bloodline, without mediation. This made them unpredictable. Worse, it made them uncontrollable. For centuries, the Church tolerated this tension. It baptized Merovingian kings, blessed their wars, and recorded their reigns. But tolerance is not acceptance. Beneath the surface, theologians and clerics worked to redefine kingship itself. The sacred had to be relocated, from blood to blessing, from lineage to liturgy. This redefinition required more than sermons. It required replacement. The Carolingians offered the perfect solution. Unlike the Merovingians, they did not claim mystical descent. Their power was administrative, military, and pragmatic. They ruled not by sacred inevitability, but by competence, and, crucially, by alliance with the Church. In exchange for legitimacy, they offered obedience. The moment this alliance crystallized, the fate of the Merovingians was sealed. But sealing a fate does not always require execution. Sometimes it requires erasure. The transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule is often described as peaceful, almost procedural. A last Merovingian king is deposed, tonsured, and sent to a monastery. A new ruler is crowned with papal blessing. History moves on. Yet this neat narrative conceals something deeply unusual. Rarely in history does a sacred dynasty disappear without bloodshed, rebellion, or civil war. And yet, in this case, resistance appears strangely muted. Unless, of course, resistance took another form. To understand this, one must look at how the Church handled memory. Medieval chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were custodians of acceptable history. What they recorded shaped reality for generations. What they omitted vanished almost entirely. After the Carolingian takeover, Merovingian kings were increasingly portrayed as weak, idle, and morally corrupt. The term Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings, entered historical language, not as an objective description, but as a narrative weapon. By framing the Merovingians as unworthy, their removal became not only acceptable, but necessary. Yet earlier sources contradict this image. They describe active rulers, complex administrations, and functioning courts. The shift in portrayal is abrupt and telling. It signals a coordinated effort to diminish not just political authority, but symbolic power. Because symbols matter. As long as the Merovingian bloodline retained its aura of sacred legitimacy, it remained a threat. Even stripped of armies, a sacred king can inspire loyalty. Even in exile, divine blood can rally followers. The church understood this danger. It had seen it before in pagan cults, in heretical movements, in rival claimants to spiritual authority. Thus, the solution was not merely to remove Merovingians from thrones, but to neutralize what made them special. Monastic confinement played a crucial role in this process. Sending former kings into monasteries served multiple purposes. It physically isolated them. It symbolically severed them from worldly power. And it reframed their story as one of repentance rather than dispossession. A tonsured king was no longer a threat. He was a cautionary tale. But monasteries also functioned as places of silence. Once inside, these individuals ceased to appear in political records. Their descendants, if any, were rarely documented. Royal women, whose marriages could transmit bloodline legitimacy, vanish almost entirely from the historical record. Genealogies fracture. Lines end abruptly, not because they truly ended, but because they were no longer meant to be seen. This is where erasure becomes more than neglect. It becomes strategy. The church did not need to destroy the Merovingian bloodline to win. It only needed to render it invisible, to ensure that future generations would not know where to look, or even that there was something missing. Yet complete erasure is difficult. Blood travels through people. Memory survives in rumor. And power, once sacred, leaves residues. What makes this period especially intriguing is the timing of certain silences. Just as Merovingian authority collapses in the West, references to Western nobles appear in Eastern contexts. Byzantine sources mention foreign princes of uncertain origin. Armenian chronicles speak of noble arrivals from distant lands. Persian texts reference alliances with Western royal houses whose names do not align with known Carolingian lines. These references are fleeting, often dismissed by historians as anomalies. But anomalies matter when patterns of silence exist elsewhere. If the church sought to eliminate the Merovingians as a competing source of sacred authority, allowing, or even encouraging, their quiet removal beyond Rome's influence would have been preferable to martyrdom or rebellion. A bloodline that disappears eastward cannot challenge papal authority in the West. A king without a kingdom is easier to forget. This interpretation casts the church not as a blunt destroyer, but as a careful architect of power. It did not burn the old world down, it built over it. Sacred kingship was not abolished. It was replaced with a version that required ecclesiastical approval. Anything outside that framework became heretical, dangerous, or simply unrecorded. And yet, something of the old belief lingered. The church itself could not fully escape the symbolism it sought to suppress. Coronation rituals retained echoes of ancient anointings. Royal bloodlines remained important, even as theology denied their inherent sanctity. The language of divine favor never disappeared. It was merely rerouted. This suggests that the Merovingians were not rejected because they were obsolete, but because they represented a rival theology of power, one that threatened the church's monopoly on the sacred. From this perspective, the end of the Merovingians appears less like a fall and more like a controlled evacuation. Their public role was terminated, their memory reshaped, their records curtailed. What happened to the people themselves, especially those beyond the last crowned kings, was simply no longer Rome's concern, or no longer Rome's business. The East lay beyond papal reach, beyond doctrinal enforcement, beyond the machinery of Western record-keeping. If a sacred bloodline had to survive somewhere, that was the safest direction for it to go. Thus, erasure in the West and survival in the East are not contradictory ideas. They are complementary strategies. The Church won control over Europe's future, but it did not necessarily annihilate Europe's past. It buried it, and buried things have a way of resurfacing, sometimes centuries later, in unexpected places. This section reveals not villains, but systems. A world reshaping itself, deciding which forms of power could remain visible and which had to disappear. The Merovingians were not destroyed because they failed. They were erased because they remembered something older than Rome was willing to tolerate. And so, as the Church consolidated its authority in the West, the old blood quietly slipped beyond its gaze, leaving behind a carefully constructed silence and a trail that leads only in one direction, eastward. There's a particular kind of silence that feels unnatural, not the silence of ignorance or decay, but the silence of deliberate omission. In historical study, such silences are often more revealing than pages filled with words. The story of the Merovingians enters this kind of silence after their fall, a void in the chronicles so abrupt and so thorough that it raises a troubling question. How does an entire sacred dynasty simply disappear from memory? When historians trace the Merovingian line through early medieval sources, they encounter a sudden narrowing of vision. Earlier texts are rich with detail: genealogies, battles, royal marriages, saints' lives connected to kings, descriptions of court ritual. But after the rise of the Carolingians, the narrative contracts. Names vanish. Relationships dissolve. What was once a clearly mapped royal family becomes a blur of half-remembered figures and unresolved endings. This is not how history normally behaves. Even defeated dynasties usually leave traces. Claimants emerge. Pretenders rally support. Exiles return. Legends of rightful heirs circulate among the people. Yet in the case of the Merovingians, none of this appears openly in Western records. The dynasty seems to dissolve without echo, unless the echoes were intentionally muted. Medieval chronicles were not comprehensive records of everything that happened. They were curated texts, written with purpose. Most were produced in monasteries or under royal patronage, shaped by theological priorities and political realities. What they chose not to include was often as important as what they recorded. Silence, in this context, is not absence of information. It is control of narrative. After the Carolingian ascent, Merovingian genealogy becomes strangely truncated. Certain royal lines simply stop being mentioned, even though demographic reality makes extinction unlikely. Royal women, who played crucial roles in transmitting bloodlines through marriage, disappear almost entirely from documentation. Children of kings are mentioned once and then never again. Burial sites are unmarked or lost. Deaths are implied rather than described. Such patterns are deeply suspicious. One might argue that records were lost to time, fire, or neglect. But this explanation fails when the loss is selective. Carolingian genealogies are meticulously preserved. Their alliances, offspring, and claims are carefully documented. The silence falls only over the dynasty they replaced. This selective forgetting suggests intentional pruning of memory. Even more curious is the treatment of the last Merovingian kings. They are reduced to symbolic figures, portrayed as passive shadows while real power supposedly lay elsewhere. Their removal is described with a sense of inevitability, almost relief. And then, nothing. No mention of their families, their movements, their final years beyond monastic confinement. For individuals of such importance, this absence is extraordinary. It is as if history itself were instructed to look away. Yet history has a habit of leaking through its own blind spots. When Western sources fall silent, Eastern ones begin to whisper. Byzantine chronicles from the same period occasionally reference Western nobles whose origins are unclear. They are described as Franks or men of northern blood, appearing suddenly at court or in military service. Their names do not correspond neatly with known Carolingian figures. Their lineage is hinted at but not elaborated. They are present but not explained. Similarly, Armenian and Georgian sources contain scattered references to foreign aristocrats settling or marrying into local noble families during the early medieval period. These figures arrive without backstory, yet quickly integrate into elite circles. Their sudden appearance coincides suspiciously with the disappearance of Merovingian figures from Western records. Historians often dismiss such references as coincidental or unrelated. But coincidence loses credibility when patterns align across regions. Silence in one corpus whispers in another. The lack of Western documentation about Merovingian movements after their fall does not mean those movements did not occur. It means they occurred beyond the scope or the permission of Western chroniclers. Once a dynasty was deemed illegitimate, recording its survival would undermine the authority of its replacements. Forgetting became policy. This practice was not unique to the Merovingians. Other cultures have employed similar strategies. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs practiced damnatio memoriae, erasing rivals from monuments and records. In Rome, disgraced emperors were struck from official histories. The medieval church inherited this tradition of controlled memory, adapting it to its own needs. In the Merovingian case, the goal was not to erase every trace, but to fragment the story so thoroughly that reconstruction would become nearly impossible. And it nearly worked. Another form of silence appears in the absence of rebellion narratives. If the Merovingians were truly sacred kings in the eyes of their people, one would expect uprisings in their name after their deposition. Yet such movements are largely absent from Western records. This has often been cited as evidence that the dynasty had lost popular support. But there is another explanation. Rebellion may not have occurred because the bloodline was no longer present to rally around. If key members of the dynasty, especially children and heirs, had already been removed from the political landscape, resistance would have lacked a focal point. Without a visible claimant, loyalty dissolves into nostalgia rather than action. In this scenario, silence is the residue of success. The removal was so thorough, so quiet, that no rupture occurred. No martyrdom, no rallying cry, just absence. And absence is hard to argue with. There is also the question of religious silence. Saints' lives were a popular medieval genre, often used to preserve the memory of royal patrons. Merovingian kings and queens had previously appeared frequently in such texts, portrayed as pious benefactors or repentant rulers. After their fall, this tradition dwindles sharply. New saints are associated with Carolingian patrons instead. This shift further marginalizes the Merovingians, not only politically but spiritually. Their presence is removed from the sacred narrative of the age. They are no longer part of God's unfolding story, at least not in the West. Yet traces of older traditions persist in unexpected places. Folklore preserves motifs of hidden kings, lost heirs, and royal figures who journey eastward or vanish into distant lands. These stories lack names and dates, making them easy to dismiss. But folklore often functions as a container for truths too dangerous or inconvenient to record officially. The motif of the king who did not die appears repeatedly across Europe. Sometimes he sleeps beneath a mountain. Sometimes he journeys to a far land. Sometimes his bloodline survives in secret, awaiting a return. These legends are not history, but they are not meaningless either. They often emerge where official history refuses to speak. The Merovingian silence fits this pattern. What makes the silence especially compelling is its longevity. Centuries pass, and still the gap remains. Later medieval historians, working with access to earlier sources, do not attempt to fill it. They accept the narrative they inherit, perpetuating the absence rather than questioning it. Silence becomes tradition. By the time Renaissance scholars revisit early medieval history, the Merovingians are already mythologized into irrelevance. Their story has been reduced to a prelude, a necessary but unimportant stage before the real history begins. This framing ensures that no one asks what happened to them, because they're no longer perceived as important enough to ask about. And yet, importance is not measured by how loudly history speaks, but by how carefully it chooses not to. The silence surrounding the Merovingians is too structured to be accidental. It appears at specific moments, affects specific individuals, and aligns with clear political incentives. It is a silence that protects something either from scrutiny or from destruction. If the Merovingian bloodline continued beyond its recorded end, silence would have been its greatest ally. Unwritten journeys leave no trail to follow. Unrecorded names cannot be hunted. Absence becomes camouflage. Thus, the chronicles do not tell us that the Merovingians went east. They tell us something more subtle and more powerful. That whatever happened to them, Western history was instructed not to remember it. And when history refuses to remember, it is often because memory would be dangerous. This section does not claim certainty. It reveals a pattern, a disappearance too clean to be natural, a silence too consistent to be random, and a growing sense that the Merovingians did not vanish into nothing, but into somewhere history was never meant to look. The next step is to follow that silence outward, toward the roads that lead beyond the chronicler's reach. When people imagine the early Middle Ages, they often picture a sealed-off Europe, isolated kingdoms, muddy roads, and populations barely aware of lands beyond their immediate horizon. This image is comforting in its simplicity, but it is profoundly misleading. In reality, the world the Merovingians inhabited was threaded together by ancient roads that had existed long before Rome, and which continued to function long after its political collapse. These routes did not merely carry goods. They carried people, ideas, beliefs, and most importantly, bloodlines. The East was not unknown to the Merovingians. It was familiar, reachable, and already woven into the fabric of elite movement. Long before the fall of the Merovingian dynasty, Eastern roads formed part of an interconnected system stretching from the Atlantic coast to the edges of Asia. Roman infrastructure had formalized many of these paths, but it did not invent them. Traders, pilgrims, diplomats, and mercenaries moved regularly along corridors that followed rivers like the Rhine and the Danube, crossed mountain passes in the Alps and the Balkans, and spilled outward toward Constantinople, the Caucasus, and Persia. These were not obscure trails. They were arteries of civilization. Merovingian elites, despite later portrayals of stagnation, were deeply embedded in this world of movement. They negotiated with Byzantium, exchanged gifts, and participated in long-distance diplomacy. Frankish weapons have been found in Eastern territories. Eastern silks and coins appear in Merovingian graves. Such evidence confirms what chronicles only hint at. The Merovingians were not provincial rulers trapped in the West, but participants in a transcontinental elite network. This matters because exile, escape, or relocation only makes sense when routes already exist. If the Merovingians, or factions within their extended family, chose to move eastward, they would not have done so blindly. They would have followed known roads, used established contacts, and relied on networks that predated their political downfall. These roads were not public highways for peasants. They were elite corridors, maintained by mutual interest and guarded by custom rather than law. One of the most important of these was the Danube corridor. Flowing from Central Europe toward the Black Sea, the Danube connected Frankish lands with the Balkans, Byzantium, and beyond. Along its banks moved soldiers, envoys, and noble families seeking opportunity or refuge. Control of this river meant access to the east without ever crossing open sea. Another route led through northern Italy and the Adriatic, linking former Roman centers with Constantinople. Despite political fragmentation, these paths remained active, maintained by merchants and monasteries alike. Monks traveled east for pilgrimage and study. Traders followed them. And where monks and merchants could travel, royal refugees could too. Pilgrimage routes deserve special attention here. By the 7th century, journeys to Jerusalem, Sinai, and other eastern holy sites were already established. Pilgrims from Gaul and Germania traveled through Byzantine territory routinely. Such journeys provided perfect cover for discreet movement. A noble family traveling under the guise of pilgrimage would attract little suspicion, especially if records were never meant to be kept. This blending of sacred travel and political movement created a gray zone in historical documentation. Pilgrims were recorded inconsistently. Their companions often went unnamed. Entire groups could move across continents without leaving clear traces in official chronicles. For a bloodline seeking disappearance rather than confrontation, this ambiguity was invaluable. Beyond Byzantium lay routes even less visible to Western historians. The Caucasus region, acting as a bridge between Europe and Asia, hosted ancient kingdoms accustomed to absorbing foreign elites. Armenian and Georgian nobility maintained dynastic ties that stretched in multiple directions. Persian roads, refined under the Sasanian Empire, linked these regions further eastward into Central Asia. These eastern systems were sophisticated, stable, and welcoming to royal blood, especially blood that carried symbolic prestige. What is rarely discussed in mainstream history is how many Western elites disappeared into these networks during times of upheaval. Mercenary leaders became local lords. Dispossessed princes entered foreign service. Marriages integrated outsiders into established dynasties. Names changed. Languages shifted. Blood endured. The Merovingians, facing erasure in the West, would have recognized the logic of this system. The East did not demand public legitimacy from Rome. It respected lineage, antiquity, and sacred kingship in forms the Merovingians understood. And, crucially, it offered space to become invisible. Another factor often overlooked is the role of women in such movements. Royal women were key transmitters of bloodline continuity. Through marriage, they could embed a lineage within another ruling house in a single generation. Yet medieval chronicles rarely tracked women with the same rigor as men. A Merovingian princess marrying eastward would vanish from Western records almost entirely, while her blood continued elsewhere under a different name. This is not speculation without precedent. Numerous noble lines across Eurasia trace origins to foreign women whose backgrounds are vaguely described or entirely omitted. These omissions are not accidents. They reflect a worldview that valued continuity over documentation. The roads east also offered ideological refuge. While the West increasingly framed authority through Christian orthodoxy, the East tolerated complexity. Byzantine theology coexisted with imperial mysticism. Persian kingship blended cosmic symbolism with governance. Steppe cultures revered ancestral blood above institutional structures. In such environments, a sacred bloodline was not threatening. It was intelligible. Thus, the roads east were not merely paths of escape. They were paths of compatibility. The fact that Western chronicles do not describe Merovingian journeys along these roads does not mean they did not occur. It means they occurred beyond the lens of Western concern. Once a dynasty was no longer politically relevant in the West, its movements ceased to matter to those recording history there. Silence, once again, becomes evidence, not of absence, but of distance. The further east one travels in historical sources, the less rigid Western categories become. Identity blurs. Titles change meaning. A Frank becomes simply a northerner. A king becomes a noble. A bloodline becomes a marriage alliance. This fluidity is precisely what would have allowed the Merovingians to survive without being recognized as such. There is also the psychological dimension of direction. In medieval imagination, the East was associated with origin, wisdom, and continuity. Eden lay in the East. Christ would return from the East. Sacred knowledge flowed from sunrise to sunset. Moving eastward was symbolically charged. It implied preservation rather than decline. For a dynasty stripped of its place in the West, such symbolism would have mattered deeply. Over time, these eastern roads faded from Western memory. The Crusades briefly reopened them, but under a different ideological framework. By then, centuries had passed. Bloodlines had settled. Names had changed. The Merovingians, if present, were no longer visible as outsiders. They had become part of the landscape. What remains today are fragments, unusual genealogies, unexplained noble origins, symbols that echo Western motifs in Eastern contexts. To modern historians, these are curiosities. To those willing to follow the roads history avoids, they're signposts. This section does not claim that the Merovingians marched east in a single, dramatic exodus. History is rarely so theatrical. Instead, it suggests a gradual, deliberate dispersal along roads already known, already trusted, already alive with movement. Some went as pilgrims, some as diplomats, some as brides and children carried quietly beyond the reach of Western record keepers. And once they passed beyond the familiar borders of Western historiography, the chronicles fell silent, not because nothing happened, but because nothing that happened was meant to be remembered there. The roads east did not disappear. They were simply forgotten. And forgotten roads are often the safest paths of all. If there was one place in the early medieval world where a displaced sacred bloodline could disappear without truly vanishing, it was Byzantium. To Western chroniclers, the Eastern Roman Empire was distant, complex, and often misunderstood. But to elites who understood power beyond borders, Byzantium was something else entirely. A sanctuary of shadows, where fallen kings could become honored guests, and where bloodlines older than Rome itself were quietly preserved beneath layers of ceremony and silence. Byzantium was not merely a continuation of Rome, it was its transformation. While the West fragmented into competing kingdoms, the East retained imperial structure, bureaucracy, and memory. Its emperors ruled not only through force, but through symbolism so dense that it bordered on the mystical. Purple-born princes, sacred coronations, and elaborate court rituals all reinforced a central idea. Power was ordained, inherited, and cosmic. This worldview would have felt familiar to the Merovingians. Unlike the Carolingians, who needed papal approval to legitimize their rule, Byzantine emperors claimed authority directly from God, mediated through tradition rather than Rome. The emperor was not crowned by a pope, but emerged from a lineage sanctified by continuity. This subtle distinction mattered greatly. It meant Byzantium understood sacred kingship in a way the West was actively abandoning. For a Merovingian elite facing erasure at the hands of Western ecclesiastical politics, Byzantium represented ideological safety. It was a place where ancient concepts of blood and legitimacy still made sense, even within a Christian framework. A place where one could belong without needing to renounce ancestral identity. Historical evidence suggests that relations between the Frankish world and Byzantium were far more intricate than often acknowledged. Diplomatic envoys traveled regularly between the two spheres. Gifts were exchanged. Titles were granted. Western nobles served in Byzantine military units, sometimes rising to prominent positions. These interactions created channels through which people, not just messages, could pass quietly. And people did pass. Byzantine records from the 7th and 8th centuries mention foreign nobles of northern or western origin entering imperial service. They are often described vaguely, their backgrounds glossed over, their pasts irrelevant to their function within the empire. What mattered was loyalty, competence, and lineage. A man of royal blood, even from a fallen house, was valuable. Yet Byzantium did not record history the way the West did. It did not obsess over foreign genealogies. It absorbed them. This absorption created a perfect environment for disappearance without destruction. A Merovingian prince or princess entering Byzantine territory would not be paraded as a claimant or threat. They would be reframed as a noble, a general, a spouse within the vast imperial network. Their name might change. Their title might shift. Their blood would endure, quietly folded into the imperial fabric. Women, in particular, would have found Byzantium a place of strategic possibility. Byzantine marriage politics were complex and often international. Royal women from distant lands married into powerful families, transmitting bloodlines across cultural boundaries. Once married, Their origins became secondary to their role. A Merovingian princess could become Byzantine nobility in a single generation, her children no longer recognizable as Western royalty, yet carrying that lineage forward. There are also symbolic echoes that suggest deeper connections. Certain Merovingian motifs, solar imagery, bees, lions, and concepts of divine favor, resonate strongly with Byzantine iconography. While such symbols were widespread, their convergence is notable. Byzantium was a collector of traditions, skilled at integrating foreign symbols into its own imperial language. This raises an unsettling possibility that some elements of Merovingian sacred kingship did not disappear, but were translated. Translation, not annihilation, was Byzantium's strength. Pagan philosophies became Christian theology. Roman law became Byzantine administration. Local customs became imperial ritual. A sacred bloodline entering this system would not need to be erased. It would be recontextualized. Western silence about Merovingian interactions with Byzantium becomes more understandable in this light. Such connections would complicate the narrative of Carolingian legitimacy. They would suggest that the old bloodline had found refuge within a rival Christian power beyond papal influence. This was not a story the West wanted to preserve. Thus, records thin. Mentions fade. What remains are hints. Some Byzantine families later claimed mysterious Western origins without elaboration. Certain generals and administrators appear in the historical record without clear ancestry, rising quickly through imperial ranks. Their competence is praised, their loyalty noted, but their past remains obscured. Historians often treat these figures as anomalies, but anomalies cluster for reasons. Byzantium also possessed something the West increasingly lacked: institutional memory without public transparency. Archives existed, but access was controlled. Knowledge was compartmentalized. One could be known at court and unknown to history simultaneously. For those seeking safety without exposure, this was ideal. The empire was also vast. One could be relocated far from Constantinople, governing a province in Anatolia or the Caucasus, effectively disappearing from central narratives while remaining within imperial protection. Such assignments were common for foreign elites, who were often seen as neutral administrators in volatile regions. If fragments of the Merovingian family entered Byzantine service, they may have been deliberately placed where their presence would attract minimal attention, yet still offer continuity and influence. There is also the matter of time. Byzantium thought in centuries, not reigns. Dynasties rose and fell, but the empire endured. A bloodline that could not rule openly could wait. It could merge. It could become invisible. And invisibility, in a world of shifting powers, is a form of strength. Later medieval legends hint at this patience. Stories of lost royal lines preserved in the East, of rightful kings awaiting return, of sacred blood guarded by empires older than Europe itself. Such tales are often dismissed as fantasy, yet they persist across cultures, suggesting a shared memory of something withheld. What Byzantium offered, above all, was legitimacy without exposure. A sanctuary not of walls, but of complexity. A place where a bloodline could survive precisely because no one outside the system would understand how to look for it. From the Western perspective, the Merovingians were gone. From the Byzantine perspective, they may have simply changed roles. This duality, absence in one world, presence in another, is the essence of shadow history. It is not about secret conspiracies plotted in darkness, but about parallel narratives that never intersect. The West told one story, the East told another, and between them, a bloodline could slip through unnoticed. By the time Western Europe re-engaged deeply with the East during the Crusades, centuries had passed. Whatever Merovingian presence existed in Byzantium would have long since blended into the imperial mosaic. Names forgotten, origins irrelevant, blood diluted yet intact. What remains now are echoes, unprovable, elusive but persistent. A sense that Byzantium knew more about Western royal history than it ever shared. That some secrets were preserved not in texts, but in people, This section does not claim Byzantium as a throne for exiled Merovingians. It proposes something more subtle and more plausible, that Byzantium functioned as a veil, a place where sacred blood could endure without challenging power structures elsewhere. A sanctuary of shadows, where disappearance did not mean destruction, but survival. And in the quiet corridors of that empire, far from Frankish forests and Roman councils, the Merovingian story may have continued, unseen, unrecorded, but alive. Beyond Byzantium, beyond the familiar borders of both Western and Eastern Roman worlds, lies a region that has always existed in between. Neither fully European nor wholly Asian, the Caucasus has for millennia served as a corridor, a refuge, and a crucible for wandering bloodlines. Mountains here do not merely divide land. They conceal it. Valleys hide peoples, traditions, and dynasties that survive precisely because larger empires overlook them. If there was a place where a displaced royal lineage could endure without drawing dangerous attention, it was here. In the early medieval period, the Caucasus was not a backwater. It was a mosaic of kingdoms. Armenia, Iberia, modern Georgia, Lazica, and smaller principalities, each balancing between great powers like Byzantium and Persia. These kingdoms understood survival through adaptation. Alliances shifted. Royal houses intermarried with foreign elites. Lineage mattered deeply, but purity mattered less than continuity. This was a world comfortable with complexity. Armenian and Georgian chronicles from late antiquity and the early Middle Ages frequently reference noble families of unclear origin. They arrive from distant lands, are described as foreign princes or men of the West, and are quickly absorbed into local aristocracy. Their genealogies are noted only briefly, if at all. What mattered was not where they came from, but that they brought prestige, martial skill, and ancient blood. To Western historians, these figures appear marginal, even irrelevant. To those studying patterns of dynastic survival, they are crucial. The Caucasus had long been a haven for displaced royalty. When Persian dynasties fell, princes fled into its mountains. When Roman politics turned lethal, nobles vanished into its valleys. The terrain itself discouraged pursuit. Empires preferred treaties and buffer states to direct control. This allowed local kings to act with relative autonomy and to shelter those who needed to disappear. For a Merovingian bloodline, seeking survival rather than restoration, this environment was ideal. Unlike Byzantium, which absorbed elites into a vast imperial system, the Caucasus allowed them to remain visible, but only locally. A foreign noble could become a regional lord, a military commander, or a royal consort without attracting the scrutiny of Rome or the Frankish world. Their past could be acknowledged without being emphasized. Their blood could persist without challenging anyone's authority. Armenian kingship in particular offers striking parallels to Merovingian ideology. Armenian royal houses trace their legitimacy through ancient, semi-mythical origins, often linking themselves to biblical or legendary ancestors. Sacred blood was not a metaphor. It was the foundation of rule. Kings were seen as protectors of both land and faith, mediators between heaven and earth. Such concepts would have resonated deeply with Merovingian tradition. Georgian kingship, too, blended Christianity with older notions of divine ancestry. Royal chronicles emphasize continuity across centuries, even when political reality fractured that continuity. Kingship was not merely a title. It was a condition inherited through blood. This worldview created a natural affinity with displaced sacred lineages from the West. There are also symbolic echoes that raise difficult questions. Certain Caucasian royal emblems, lions, solar motifs, sacred standards, mirror Western royal symbolism associated with early Frankish kings. While such symbols were widespread, their specific combinations and context suggest transmission rather than coincidence. Transmission requires carriers. Consider also the timing. The period during which Merovingian figures disappear from Western records aligns closely with increased movement and restructuring among Caucasian elites. Dynastic reshuffling, new noble houses emerging, alliances formed with outsiders. These are precisely the conditions under which a foreign bloodline could be integrated quietly. And then there are the genealogical gaps. Many Caucasian noble families claim ancient origins but cannot trace them continuously. At certain points, an ancestor appears suddenly, already powerful, already noble, with no clear local lineage. These gaps are often explained away as lost records or legendary embellishment. Yet when such gaps coincide with known moments of Western dynastic erasure, they invite closer attention. The mountains themselves play a role in this story. Geography is not neutral. The Caucasus has always fragmented authority. Even when empires claimed sovereignty, local rulers retained significant independence. This fragmentation allowed multiple narratives to coexist. One could be loyal to Byzantium publicly, maintain local traditions privately, and preserve foreign bloodlines quietly. Such layered identity was normal here. If fragments of the Merovingian family entered this region, perhaps through Byzantium, perhaps directly via eastern routes, they would not have needed to announce themselves. Their lineage could be acknowledged within a narrow circle, protected by marriage and custom. Over generations, their descendants would become indistinguishable from local nobility, except perhaps in whispered origin stories or ritual privileges passed down privately. Western historians rarely look here for answers. The Caucasus sits outside traditional narratives of European history. Its sources are written in languages few scholars master. Its chronicles blend myth and history unapologetically. For modern academia, it is easier to ignore than to integrate. But ignoring borderlands is how hidden histories survive. There's also the matter of religious nuance. The Armenian Church developed independently of Rome, maintaining theological positions that sometimes placed it at odds with Western Christianity. This independence further insulated the region from papal influence. A sacred bloodline unwelcome in the West would find fewer ideological obstacles here. Moreover, Armenia and Georgia both understood exile not as disgrace, but as destiny. Their histories are filled with kings who lost thrones, regained them, or ruled in displacement. The idea that a royal family could survive without a crown was culturally intelligible. In such a context, Merovingian survival would not have seemed strange. It would have seemed appropriate. Legends from the region speak of Western kings arriving in times of upheaval, bringing with them sacred relics, ancient knowledge, or royal blood destined to merge with local lines. These legends lack names and dates, making them difficult to verify. But their persistence suggests collective memory, not invention. Memory does not require documentation to endure. The Caucasus also functioned as a gateway further east. From here, roads led into Persia, Central Asia, and beyond. A bloodline that survived here could later move again, fragmenting further, embedding itself even deeper into the fabric of Eurasian nobility. Disappearance, in this sense, was not a single act, but a process. What makes the Caucasus hypothesis compelling is not that it offers clear proof, but that it explains the pattern we observe. The Merovingians vanish from Western records. Eastern empires absorb foreign elites. Border kingdoms show sudden appearances of noble lines with no clear origin. Sacred kingship traditions persist outside Rome's influence. Taken together, these elements form a plausible landscape of survival. This section does not claim that the Merovingians ruled Caucasian kingdoms or founded new dynasties under the same name. That would have been too visible. Instead, it suggests something far more consistent with historical behavior: quiet integration, strategic marriage, local power without global recognition. Hidden thrones do not need crowns. They need continuity. In the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, away from the eyes of Western chroniclers and papal authority, a sacred bloodline could do what it had always done best: endure. To move beyond the Caucasus is to enter a world where kingship was not merely political, but cosmic. Ancient Persia, even in its late and transitional forms, preserved one of the oldest and most resilient concepts of royal authority in human history. Here, kings did not rule by election or approval. They ruled by divine radiance, by a sacred force believed to attach itself to certain bloodlines and abandon others. This idea, known as Kvarina, shaped Persian kingship for centuries. And for a displaced dynasty like the Merovingians, it would have felt hauntingly familiar. The Persian world was no stranger to absorbing foreign elites. Empires rise not by purity, but by integration. The Sasanian Empire and later Persian polities routinely welcomed nobles from distant lands, especially those carrying royal blood. Such individuals were valuable not only for their military or administrative skills, but for the symbolic weight they carried. Royal blood, regardless of origin, was seen as a vessel of divine favor. This worldview created a rare compatibility between Persian and Merovingian notions of kingship. Merovingian rulers believed their authority resided in blood and physical markers, sacred hair, ancestral descent, inherited legitimacy. Persian kings believed their authority resided in radiance, an invisible yet tangible glory that marked the chosen ruler. In both cases, kingship was not granted, it was recognized, and recognition could occur across cultural boundaries. There are subtle but intriguing hints that such recognition may have occurred. Persian sources from the late Sasanian and early Islamic periods occasionally reference Western nobles or Frankish figures entering Persian service or courtly life. These mentions are brief, often lacking genealogical detail, but their very existence challenges the notion that the East and West were isolated from one another. Political necessity, trade, and shared enemies created unexpected alliances. More compelling, however, are the symbolic resonances. The lion occupies a central place in Persian royal imagery. It represents strength, divine favor, and rightful rule. Kings are associated with lions not as conquerors, but as embodiments of cosmic order. This symbolism appears repeatedly in Persian art, literature, and royal ritual. Curiously, the lion also emerges in Merovingian and early Frankish symbolism, though less prominently documented. It appears in royal regalia, later heraldic traditions, and in mythic associations with kingship. While some scholars argue that lion symbolism spread later through Crusader contact, this explanation fails to account for earlier parallels. Symbols do not migrate randomly. They follow people. If Merovingian elites encountered Persian royal culture, whether directly or through intermediaries in the Caucasus or Byzantium, they would have recognized a kindred language of power, a place where kingship was still mystical, where blood mattered, where divine favor could be inherited rather than bestowed. This recognition could have facilitated integration. Persian courts were adept at reframing outsiders. A foreign prince did not remain foreign for long. He became a general, a governor, a son-in-law. His origins were acknowledged, then absorbed. Over time, his descendants were simply Persian nobility, yet their blood carried stories no one bothered to record. Western historians rarely consider Persia in discussions of early European dynasties. The distance feels too great, the cultures too different. But distance in antiquity was not measured in miles. It was measured in access. And Persia was accessible through the same networks that linked the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Trade routes carried more than goods. They carried trust. One must also consider the collapse of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century. Political upheaval created opportunities for restructuring. Old elites fell. New ones rose. Foreign nobles could find positions amid the chaos, especially if they brought military experience and royal prestige. Displaced bloodlines often thrive in transitional periods. If Merovingian figures arrived in Persian territory during or after this collapse, they would have encountered a world accustomed to reinvention, a world where lineage could be reinterpreted, names changed, and power redistributed. Islamic sources, which later documented Persian history, often preserved older royal concepts beneath new religious language. Kingship remained associated with justice, radiance, and ancestral legitimacy. The divine glow did not disappear. It was reframed. This continuity matters. It means that a sacred bloodline could survive ideological shifts without losing its essence. The Merovingians, having already navigated the transition from paganism to Christianity, would have understood this adaptability. The idea of lion kings thus becomes more than metaphor. It represents a shared royal language that transcended geography, a way of understanding authority that could migrate without losing meaning. There are also genealogical curiosities worth noting. Some Persian and Central Asian noble families claim origins that are vaguely Western or Northern, described only as from the lands beyond the sunset. These claims are rarely elaborated. They are presented as facts, not stories. Over time, they became unimportant, except as markers of ancient prestige. Modern historians often dismiss such claims as legend or self-aggrandizement. Yet similar claims in European genealogies are often taken seriously, even when evidence is thin. This double standard obscures the possibility of real eastward movement. The Persian world also offered another crucial advantage: scale. Empires absorb individuals easily because they are large. A single family can disappear into the machinery of administration, its identity diluted but preserved. Small kingdoms remember. Large empires forget. For a bloodline seeking long-term survival, forgetfulness is protection. There is also the spiritual dimension. Persian cosmology emphasized balance between order and chaos, light and darkness. Kings were guardians of this balance. This concept mirrors the Merovingian self-image as mediators between worlds, human and divine, old and new. Such philosophical compatibility is rare. It suggests that integration would not have required ideological surrender, only translation. None of this constitutes direct proof. But history rarely offers proof when disappearance is intentional. What it offers are patterns of compatibility, opportunity, and silence. The Persian connection fills a crucial gap. It explains how a Western sacred bloodline could survive beyond the reach of Rome and Byzantium alike. It provides a cultural environment where kingship based on blood and divine favor was not only accepted, but expected. And it offers an answer to a lingering question: where could the Merovingians go that would not demand they abandon who they were? The answer may lie in a world where kings still believe themselves chosen by fate, marked by invisible fire, and symbolized by the lion. In such a world, a fallen king was not a failure. He was simply between crowns. When bloodlines move, they rarely move alone. Kings may travel disguised, families may fragment, names may change, but objects endure. Sacred objects, especially, tend to follow those who believe they are bound to them. Throughout history, when dynasties fall or retreat, relics become the true vessels of continuity. They carry legitimacy, memory, and authority in a form that survives exile. If the Merovingian bloodline journeyed eastward, as the previous section suggests, it is unlikely they traveled empty-handed. The question is not whether something was carried with them, but what. Medieval Europe was saturated with relic culture. Bones of saints, fragments of the cross, sacred stones, crowns, rings, and texts were not symbolic curiosities. They were instruments of power. Possessing a relic meant possessing divine favor. Losing one meant vulnerability. Kings guarded such objects fiercely, often more carefully than territory itself. The Merovingians, with their belief in sacred blood, would have understood this better than most. Long before later Grail romances entered popular imagination, there existed older traditions of royal objects tied to legitimacy. These were not literary inventions, but ancestral tokens, stones used in coronations, staffs associated with law-giving, vessels linked to divine ancestry. Such objects were rarely described in detail, precisely because their power depended on secrecy. One of the most persistent myths associated with early European kingship is that of a sacred vessel. Later Christian tradition would identify this with the Holy Grail, But earlier forms of the story speak more vaguely of a life-giving container, a stone, or a source of divine nourishment. These stories appear across cultures, suggesting a shared archetype rather than a single artifact. For the Merovingians, whose legitimacy predated full Christian orthodoxy, such an object would not necessarily have been Christian in origin. It may have been reinterpreted later as belief systems shifted. What mattered was continuity, not theology. This raises a possibility often ignored by mainstream historians, that the Grail tradition did not begin as a Christian legend, but as a royal one, a symbol of sacred blood, divine favor, and rightful rule, carried, guarded, and eventually mythologized. If this is the case, then the movement of the Merovingian bloodline eastward would logically involve the movement of whatever object embodied that legitimacy. Leaving it behind would have been unthinkable. Sacred authority cannot be abandoned without consequence. There are also references, scattered and cryptic, to royal stones associated with early Frankish kings. Stones used for oath-taking, coronation, or judgment. In ancient cultures, stones were believed to anchor divine power to the earth. To rule without them was to rule without grounding. Such stones appear in Eastern traditions as well. Persian kings ruled from thrones associated with sacred stones. Caucasian coronations involved ancestral objects passed through generations. Even in Central Asia, rulership was often tied to possession of a physical token believed to carry heaven's mandate. These parallels suggest not coincidence, but continuity. Texts may also have traveled. Scrolls containing genealogies, laws, or sacred knowledge would have been invaluable to a dynasty forced into concealment. Such documents could preserve identity across generations, even when public acknowledgement was impossible. They could instruct descendants who they were, where they came from, and why they must remain hidden. Medieval Europe was deeply aware of the power of written lineage. Genealogies were political weapons. Control the family tree, and you control legitimacy. The church understood this well, which is why so many genealogies were rewritten or suppressed. If Merovingian elites possessed their own records, independent of ecclesiastical approval, those records would have been dangerous in the West and priceless in exile. Eastern cultures placed immense value on ancestral texts. Persian courts preserved royal chronicles. Armenian monasteries guarded genealogies as sacred trust. Byzantine archives were vast and controlled. A Western royal family bringing ancient texts would have been welcomed as carriers of prestige and knowledge. This also explains the emergence of later legends connecting sacred objects with the East. Medieval Grail romances consistently locate the Grail not in Rome, but in distant, often vaguely Eastern realms. The Grail castle lies beyond familiar geography. Its guardians are foreign, mysterious, and bound by blood rather than law. Such stories do not arise in a vacuum. They reflect memory distorted by time. The Templars, centuries later, would become obsessed with Eastern relics and secret genealogies. They believed something vital had been lost in the West and preserved elsewhere. Their focus on Jerusalem, Armenia, and Persia mirrors the routes we have already traced. This obsession did not come from nowhere. It was inherited. Relics, unlike people, leave symbolic trails. Art, literature, and rumor preserve their movement even when facts are erased. When Western Europe lost access to certain symbols of kingship, it began to mythologize them. The object became unreachable, mysterious, holy. The East, meanwhile, treated such objects pragmatically. A relic was powerful, but not unique. It could be integrated, guarded, recontextualized. Its meaning could shift without being destroyed. This difference in attitude matters. It suggests that while the West romanticized what it lost, the East preserved what it received. There is also the possibility that multiple objects traveled. Bloodlines often distribute their power across symbols to reduce risk. A vessel here, a stone there, a text elsewhere. Fragmentation ensures survival. If one piece is lost, another remains. This strategy aligns with the broader pattern of Merovingian disappearance. Not a single dramatic flight, but a gradual dispersal. Not one heir, but many. Not one relic, but several, each carrying a piece of identity forward. Modern historians struggle with this idea because it resists neat conclusions. There is no single artifact to point to, no definitive discovery to announce. Instead, there are echoes, recurring symbols, parallel myths, inexplicable reverence for objects whose origins are unclear. Yet this is precisely how sacred continuity works. The power of relics lies not in their material, but in the belief invested in them. That belief travels with people. When people move, belief moves. When belief moves, history changes direction quietly. If the Merovingians carried relics eastward, they did not intend for them to be found by future scholars. They intended for them to function, to anchor legitimacy, to remind descendants of who they were, to ensure survival without exposure. In time, the original meaning of these objects may have blurred. A royal stone becomes a holy relic. A genealogical scroll becomes a sacred text. A vessel of kingship becomes the Grail. Transformation does not negate origin. It conceals it. This section does not claim to identify the Grail, the stone, or the scroll. It suggests something more important. That power does not disappear when thrones fall. It relocates into symbols, objects, and stories. And those symbols, once set in motion, leave trails that stretch across continents. The Merovingian journey, if it occurred, was not only a movement of people, but of meaning. And meaning, once mobile, reshapes history far more effectively than armies ever could. Whatever they carried eastward, it was valuable enough to protect with silence. And silence, as we have seen, was their greatest weapon. History often credits kings and generals with shaping the past, but the true architects of continuity are usually quieter figures. Monks who copied texts instead of writing new ones. Merchants who traveled routes no chronicler bothered to describe. Messengers who carried symbols instead of letters. When bloodlines needed to move without being seen, these were the people who made it possible. If the Merovingian legacy survived beyond its official end, it did so not through armies or declarations, but through networks that thrived on discretion. By the early medieval period, monasteries had become the most stable institutions in Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell, but monasteries endured. They preserved knowledge, sheltered elites, and maintained connections that transcended political borders. To the church, monasteries were spiritual centers. To history, they were archives. But to those who understood their deeper function, monasteries were also safe houses. Merovingian kings had long-standing relationships with monastic communities. They endowed abbeys, placed relatives within them, and used them as centers of influence. When political power slipped from their grasp, these same institutions became pathways of survival. A monastery could hide a former king in plain sight, reframing exile as devotion. But it could also do something more subtle, facilitate movement. Monks traveled extensively. They journeyed between scriptoria, pilgrimage sites, and ecclesiastical councils. They carried letters, relics, and knowledge across vast distances. Crucially, they were trusted. A monk moving eastward attracted far less suspicion than a noble entourage. And where monks traveled, others could follow. Merchants formed the second pillar of this quiet network. Trade did not collapse with Rome. It adapted. Long-distance commerce continued, especially in luxury goods like silk, spices, metals, and manuscripts. These merchants moved along routes that bypassed political centers, following rivers, mountain passes, and coastal paths that had been used for centuries. Unlike armies, merchants did not announce themselves. Unlike diplomats, they did not leave detailed records. Their movements were practical, repetitive, and largely invisible to chroniclers focused on kings and battles. This made them ideal carriers of people and information. Merchants and monks often traveled together. Monasteries relied on trade. Merchants relied on monastic hospitality. This symbiosis created a shadow infrastructure that linked Western Europe to Byzantium, the Caucasus, Persia, and beyond. It was not centralized. It did not need permission. and it left very few traces. Within this infrastructure, coded communication flourished. Medieval elites were adept at symbolism. They used allegory, marginalia, and visual language to convey meaning without explicit statements. Maps, in particular, were rarely literal. Early medieval maps were symbolic representations of worldview rather than geography. East was placed at the top. Sacred sites were emphasized over distances. Borders were fluid. Such maps could encode information intelligible only to those who knew how to read them. A pilgrimage map might double as a route guide. A depiction of paradise might mark a safe haven. A seemingly decorative symbol might indicate a trusted monastery or allied family. To outsiders, these were religious images. To insiders, they were instructions. There is evidence that certain monastic manuscripts contain unusual marginal symbols that do not align with standard iconography. Their meanings are debated, often dismissed as scribal flourishes or errors. Yet patterns emerge when these manuscripts are compared across regions. Similar symbols appear in texts produced hundreds of miles apart, suggesting shared knowledge rather than coincidence. Coded language also appears in hagiographies, the lives of saints. These texts often describe journeys, trials, and exiles that mirror real political movements. A saint fleeing persecution may echo a royal exile. A miraculous crossing may symbolize a dangerous passage. Names are changed, but the structure remains. Such narratives allowed information to be preserved under the guise of devotion. They were read, copied, and circulated widely, carrying layered meaning to those trained to see it. Maps and texts were not the only carriers of code. Oral tradition played a crucial role. Merchants remembered routes. Monks remembered lineages. Families passed down stories framed as legend rather than history. These stories could survive for generations, protected by ambiguity. The idea of lost kings or hidden heirs appears repeatedly in medieval folklore. These figures often travel disguised, protected by holy men, guided by signs rather than armies. While such tales are usually treated as fiction, they often encode social memory. They preserve truths too dangerous or inconvenient to record directly. The Merovingians, reduced to silence in official history, would have benefited enormously from this system. Their survival did not depend on public recognition. It depended on remembrance within trusted networks. Monasteries could remember without writing. Merchants could move without explaining. Maps could guide without naming. This system also explains why later generations struggled to trace the bloodline. Without clear documentation, lineage becomes a matter of inheritance rather than proof. Names change, languages shift, only fragments remain, symbols, stories, and unexplained connections. Consider the recurring appearance of certain symbols across distant regions. Bees, lions, solar motifs, sacred vessels. These symbols appear in Merovingian contexts and reappear along Eastern routes centuries later. While each instance can be explained individually, together they suggest continuity of symbolic language. Symbolic language is the grammar of secrecy. There is also the matter of trust. Networks survive only if trust is maintained. Monasteries trusted other monasteries. Merchants trusted certain routes and hosts. These trust networks often aligned with older loyalties rather than current politics. A family that had once supported a Merovingian king might continue to do so quietly, even after his fall. Over time, such loyalties become invisible to outsiders. They are expressed in hospitality, marriage, and protection rather than proclamations. They do not appear in chronicles, but they shape lives. The East offered expansion of this network. Eastern monasteries, particularly in Armenia and Persia, maintained connections with Western monastic traditions. Scholars traveled between them. Manuscripts were exchanged. Knowledge flowed both ways. These connections provided continuity across continents. If Merovingian relics or genealogies were carried east, monasteries would have been the safest custodians. Their archives were private, their authority moral rather than political, their memory long. Merchants, meanwhile, ensured movement remained possible. Routes could be adjusted. Destinations changed. If one path became dangerous, another opened. Flexibility was built into the system. This is why no single exodus appears in history. Instead, there is diffusion, small movements over time, individuals and families traveling separately, guided by shared knowledge, but never gathering in ways that could be observed easily. To modern historians, this looks like disappearance. To those who understand networks, it looks like success. Coded maps, symbolic texts, and trusted intermediaries do not leave the kind of evidence modern scholarship prefers. They leave impressions, patterns, anomalies, things that feel intentional but resist proof. This resistance frustrates researchers trained to value documentation above all else. Yet history is not only what is written. It is also what is preserved quietly, transmitted through habit and belief. The Merovingians, if they survived, did so by embracing this quieter form of continuity. They allowed their story to fragment, trusting that fragments would be enough. Enough to remember, enough to endure. And so the monks kept copying. The merchants kept traveling. The maps kept pointing east, though few knew how to read them. What remained was not a visible dynasty, but a living network, one that carried blood, memory, and meaning far beyond the reach of Western chronicles. And within that network, the Merovingian legacy did not need to be named to be real. Between the worlds of Byzantium and Persia, north of the Caucasus and south of the steppe, there once existed a power that modern history struggles to categorize. Neither fully European nor wholly Eastern, neither pagan nor conventionally Christian, the Khazar Khaganate occupied a liminal space, geographic, political, and spiritual. And it is precisely this liminality that makes the Khazars impossible to ignore in the story of a bloodline that learned how to disappear. The Khazars ruled not through sheer conquest, but through balance. Their empire sat astride the most important trade routes of Eurasia, controlling the flow of goods, people, and ideas between East and West. Silk from China, silver from the Islamic world, furs from the north, and texts from Byzantium all passed through Khazar lands. Where trade flows, elites follow. Where elites follow, bloodlines intersect. Unlike many empires, the Khazars did not impose a single religious identity on their ruling class, at least not at first. Pagan traditions coexisted with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. This tolerance was not accidental. It was strategic. By remaining religiously flexible, the Khazars avoided subordination to any single external power. Then, sometime between the 8th and 9th centuries, something remarkable happened. The Khazar elite formally adopted Judaism. This conversion has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would a powerful steppe empire choose a religion that aligned it with no dominant neighbor? Why reject Christianity, which would have strengthened ties with Byzantium, or Islam, which would have aligned them with the caliphate? The standard explanation is political neutrality. Judaism placed the Khazars outside the ideological claims of both Christian and Muslim empires. But this explanation, while practical, may not be complete. Conversion is never merely political for ruling elites. It reshapes identity, lineage, and legitimacy. For a ruling class deeply concerned with ancestry and blood, Judaism offered something unique. Kingship defined by lineage rather than territorial conquest. Descent mattered. Genealogy mattered. Sacred authority was inherited, not granted by an external institution. This alone should raise questions. Judaism, especially in its royal and biblical traditions, preserved one of the oldest models of sacred bloodline legitimacy. Kings descended from chosen ancestors. Covenant was inherited. Authority flowed through genealogy. These ideas closely resemble the Merovingian conception of kingship, far more than the hierarchical ecclesiastical model developing in the West. This similarity has not gone unnoticed by alternative historians. Some have suggested that the Khazar conversion may have been influenced by contact with displaced royal elites from the West, elites who carried ancient concepts of sacred blood, and who sought a religious framework compatible with survival outside Roman Christianity. This is not to say the Khazars became Merovingians, or that Merovingians became Khazars in any simplistic sense. History rarely works that way, but interaction between elite groups often produces hybrid outcomes. Ideas merge, traditions adapt, bloodlines intertwine. The Khazar court was known for welcoming foreign nobles. Byzantine sources describe it as cosmopolitan, multilingual, and sophisticated. Envoys from Francia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world all interacted with Khazar rulers. Marriage alliances were common. Royal hostages were exchanged. Children were raised across cultures. This created an environment where a Western sacred bloodline could exist without exposure. Consider the timing. The Khazar conversion occurs after the Merovingians vanish from Western records. It occurs in a region already identified as a corridor of elite movement. It introduces a religious framework uniquely suited to preserving lineage without external oversight. Coincidence is possible. Pattern is harder to dismiss. There are also persistent medieval legends linking lost royal lines to Khazaria. Some Jewish traditions speak of noble converts arriving from distant lands. Some Christian sources hint darkly at Eastern kings who abandoned Rome's authority. These references are vague, often polemical, and difficult to verify. But they exist, and where legends cluster, history often hides. The idea of royal conversion deserves careful attention. Conversion does not erase bloodline, it reframes it. A king who converts does not cease to be a king. He becomes a king under a new covenant. For a bloodline seeking survival rather than restoration, conversion could offer both protection and legitimacy. Judaism, unlike Christianity or Islam, did not demand universal expansion. It did not require public conquest or missionary zeal. It allowed elites to exist quietly, preserving identity without challenging surrounding powers. This made it an ideal refuge for those who wish to endure rather than dominate. From this perspective, the Khazar conversion may represent more than a political maneuver. It may represent a strategic convergence of bloodline ideology. The Khazar ruling structure itself was unusual. Power was divided between a ceremonial king and a ruling Khaganbek. This dual kingship echoes ancient models found in both Germanic and Near Eastern traditions. One figure embodied sacred legitimacy, the other exercised practical authority. Such systems allow sacred blood to be preserved without direct exposure to political risk. The Merovingians, whose later kings were increasingly ceremonial while mayors of the palace ruled, would have found this structure eerily familiar. This parallel raises an unsettling possibility that the Merovingian model of kingship did not vanish, but reappeared in altered form within Khazar society. Even after the Khazar Khaganate declined, its legacy did not disappear. Its people dispersed into Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Noble families integrated into surrounding societies. Bloodlines fragmented, but did not vanish. Some scholars have suggested that elements of Khazar elite culture survived in unexpected places, among Eastern European nobility, steppe aristocracies, and even later mercantile elites. If Merovingian blood had entered this system, its trail would become nearly impossible to follow. This is where the shadow deepens. Western Europe, during the Middle Ages, developed a persistent fascination with the idea of lost tribes, Eastern kings, and hidden lineages. Some of these ideas were projected onto the Khazars, often in distorted or hostile ways. The Khazars became a screen onto which Europe projected anxieties about legitimacy, conversion, and sacred ancestry. Such projection suggests incomplete knowledge, something half-remembered, poorly understood, and deeply unsettling. Modern historians often resist linking Western royal bloodlines with the Khazars, fearing speculation or ideological misuse. This caution is understandable, yet avoiding the topic entirely leaves a conspicuous gap. The Khazars sit precisely where the Merovingian trail grows cold. They occupy the space where Western silence meets Eastern ambiguity. It is here, in this overlap, that shadow history thrives. No document will ever announce that a Merovingian prince converted at the Khazar court. No chronicle will trace a direct line. Such clarity would contradict the very logic of survival we have been tracing. What we are left with instead are resonances, structural, symbolic, ideological. Sacred blood, dual kingship, conversion as preservation, lineage without publicity. These are not random features. They form a coherent strategy across cultures. Whether through direct integration or indirect influence, the Khazar world represents a plausible stage in the Merovingian journey east. A place where royal blood could be protected by obscurity, where identity could be maintained through tradition rather than proclamation, and where conversion served not as erasure, but as transformation. This does not diminish the Khazars. It elevates them as participants in a much larger story of elite survival across collapsing worlds. Empires fall, churches rise, names change, but blood remembers. And in the shadow of the Khazars, between East and West, between religions, between histories, a forgotten royal legacy may have found one of its safest hiding places. Not in glory, but in balance. By the time the Knights Templar emerged onto the stage of history, the world had changed dramatically. The Western Church was powerful, kingdoms were more centralized, and crusading ideology had reshaped Europe's relationship with the East. And yet, beneath the armor, beneath the vows and banners, the Templars carried something far older than crusade theology. They carried memory, not written openly, not taught publicly, but preserved through symbols, traditions, and an obsession with origins that has puzzled historians for centuries. The Templars did not behave like an ordinary military order. From the very beginning, they operated as if they were following a script written long before their founding. They knew where to dig. They knew which places mattered. And they seemed convinced that the East held something essential that the West had lost. This conviction did not arise spontaneously in the 12th century. When the Templars established their headquarters in Jerusalem, they did not choose a random location. They settled on the Temple Mount, a site layered with sacred history, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. Officially, they were poor knights protecting pilgrims. Unofficially, they were granted extraordinary access, autonomy, and trust. They excavated beneath the temple, conducted secretive activities, and produced no clear records of what they found. The silence is telling. What makes the Templars especially relevant to the Merovingian story is their fixation on blood, lineage, and hidden legitimacy. Later medieval traditions, though often dismissed as romantic inventions, consistently link the Templars to secret genealogies, sacred relics, and lost royal lines. These traditions did not emerge in isolation. They drew on older memories that had been circulating quietly for generations. The Templars believed the East remembered what the West had forgotten. They were not merely searching for holy objects. They were searching for continuity. Several clues point in this direction. Templar symbolism departs in subtle ways from mainstream Christian imagery. Their use of the Red Cross, their reverence for the Temple of Solomon, their emphasis on inner purity over public piety, all suggest an order operating with layered meaning. To the public, they were Christian knights. To initiates, they may have been guardians of something far more complex. One of the most persistent legends surrounding the Templars is their connection to the Holy Grail. While modern audiences often associate the Grail with romantic literature, medieval writers treated it with unusual seriousness. The Grail was not simply a cup. It was a vessel of legitimacy, a symbol of rightful kingship, often guarded by a hidden lineage rather than a church. In many Grail stories, the guardians of the Grail are not priests, but kings. Broken kings, wounded kings, kings whose lands have fallen into decay because something sacred has been lost. Restoration comes not through conquest, but through recognition of blood and memory. These themes mirror the Merovingian narrative with uncanny precision. It is no coincidence that Grail legends flourish in regions once associated with Merovingian power. Nor is it coincidence that these legends consistently point eastward when explaining the Grail's origins or current location. The Grail is rarely said to reside in Rome. It is found beyond borders, beyond familiar authority, guarded by those who exist outside official hierarchies. The Templars' role in these stories is ambiguous, but persistent. They are often portrayed as seekers, protectors, or intermediaries, never as creators. This suggests inheritance rather than invention. What, then, did the Templars inherit? The answer may lie in their unusual relationship with Eastern Christian communities. Unlike other Western orders, the Templars maintained close ties with Armenians, Syriac Christians, and other Eastern groups whose traditions developed independently of Rome. These communities preserved older forms of Christianity, often blended with pre-Christian customs and strong emphasis on lineage and continuity. It is within these communities that memories of displaced Western elites could have survived. Eastern Christians remembered things differently. Their histories were not shaped by the same political needs as Western chronicles. They had no reason to erase the Merovingians or validate the Carolingians. Their memory was local, oral, and symbolic. Stories of foreign kings, sacred bloodlines, and ancient alliances could persist without being systematized. When the Templars arrived in the East, they did not encounter a blank slate. They encountered memory. This may explain their confidence, their willingness to challenge authority, their apparent lack of fear when confronting kings and popes alike. An order that believed it guarded ancient legitimacy would not see itself as subordinate to temporary powers. The destruction of the Templars in the early 14th century reinforces this interpretation. The charges brought against them were bizarre, symbolic, and focused on secrecy rather than concrete crimes. They were accused of hidden beliefs, secret rituals, and denial of orthodox authority. Such accusations are typical when institutions challenge ideological monopolies. More telling is what was never clarified, what the Templars actually knew. After their dissolution, legends proliferated. Some claimed the Templars escaped with treasure. Others claimed they preserved secret bloodlines. Still others believed they carried knowledge into new orders, new families, new lands. While these stories vary, they share a core assumption. The Templars were custodians of something that could not be allowed to remain visible. This mirrors the fate of the Merovingians themselves. In this light, the Templars appear less as originators of conspiracy and more as inheritors of unfinished history. They did not create the idea of a hidden royal bloodline. They encountered it. They did not invent Eastern secrecy. They stepped into it. Their obsession with the East was not about geography. It was about preservation. Even their architectural legacy reflects this. Templar churches often feature circular designs echoing the Temple of Solomon, but also older sacred geometries associated with cosmological order. Such designs are not accidental. They reflect a worldview in which space, blood, and divinity are linked. When the Templars vanished, they did so in a manner eerily similar to the Merovingians centuries earlier. Not annihilated entirely, not explained fully, scattered, absorbed, remembered through symbols rather than records. Some traditions suggest that Templar knowledge passed into noble families, secret societies, or regional brotherhoods. Whether literal or symbolic, this idea reinforces the theme we have been tracing: continuity through concealment. The Templars did not need to proclaim what they knew. Proclamation would have destroyed it. What matters is not whether the Templars could trace a direct genealogical line to the Merovingians. History rarely preserves such clarity. What matters is that the Templars behaved as though such a line existed, as though the East held the key to legitimacy lost in the West, as though blood mattered more than crowns. In doing so, they acted as living bridges between eras, between a time when kings ruled by sacred blood and a time when power had become institutionalized. The Templars remind us that history does not move in straight lines. It loops, it hides, it waits, and sometimes the most dangerous knowledge is not written in books, but carried in memory, passed from one generation to the next, eastward and westward, through silence rather than speech. If the Merovingian bloodline survived its erasure, it would have needed guardians who understood the value of secrecy, guardians who knew when to search and when to disappear. The Templars may not have been the bloodline itself, but they may have been its memory. By this point in the journey, the question is no longer whether the Merovingian bloodline could have survived, but whether it ever truly disappeared at all. Piece by piece, the narrative of extinction begins to collapse under its own weight. Too many silences align too perfectly. Too many Eastern echoes answer Western absences. Too many patterns repeat across cultures, centuries, and borders to be dismissed as coincidence. What emerges instead is a far more unsettling conclusion. The Merovingian bloodline did not end. It adapted. History prefers endings. They are neat, teachable, and reassuring. A dynasty rises, a dynasty falls, and another takes its place. But bloodlines do not obey historical convenience. They obey biology, memory, and strategy. When power becomes dangerous, blood learns how to hide. The Merovingians understood this better than most. They had ruled in an age when kingship was sacred, when authority flowed through ancestry rather than approval, when a king was believed to embody the health of the land itself. This worldview did not simply vanish because Rome reasserted itself or because the church redefined legitimacy. Belief systems rooted in blood and myth do not collapse overnight. They retreat, they fracture, they wait. The great revelation, then, is not a single document or discovery. It is the realization that survival does not always look like survival. Sometimes it looks like disappearance. Consider what extinction would have required. The complete eradication of an extended royal family across multiple generations. The elimination of women as well as men. The prevention of all marriage alliances. The silence of all allies. The loss of all memory. This is not merely unlikely, it is historically implausible. No other sacred dynasty in history ends this way. Instead, what we see is something far more consistent with elite behavior during times of ideological shift, dispersal. Some members remain behind, neutralized and reframed as irrelevant. Others move outward along trusted routes. Children are married into foreign houses. Names change, titles disappear, blood remains. When the Merovingian kings were officially removed from power, the West believed the problem solved. The church had secured its authority. The Carolingians ruled with papal blessing. History, it seemed, had turned a page. But history does not turn pages. It accumulates layers. Beyond the reach of Western chroniclers, fragments of the bloodline entered systems that did not fear sacred ancestry. Byzantium absorbed them. The Caucasus sheltered them. Persia recognized them. The Khazar world reframed them. Each region offered something different: protection, compatibility, anonymity, continuity. This was not a single migration, but a generational process. A slow diffusion that ensured no single point of failure. No visible heir. No obvious throne to reclaim. Only survival. And survival was the true objective. The idea of a hidden bloodline unsettles modern sensibilities because it challenges the assumption that power is always visible. But for most of human history, power has been as much about endurance as dominance. The Merovingians, stripped of public rule, may have chosen endurance. This reframes everything that followed. The Carolingians did not replace a dead dynasty. They replaced a visible one. The church did not destroy sacred kingship. It pushed it out of sight. Western Europe did not eliminate older ideas of divine blood. It suppressed them, allowing them to resurface later in altered forms: legends, romances, secret traditions. This helps explain why medieval Europe became obsessed with lost kings and hidden heirs. Why Grail legends fixated on wounded bloodlines rather than institutional salvation. Why legitimacy was so often portrayed as something inherited rather than granted. These were not fantasies. They were cultural memories trying to speak. The great revelation is that the Merovingian story never truly ended. It simply left the stage. And in leaving, it shaped the story that followed far more profoundly than if it had remained. By disappearing, the Merovingians became a template for survival without sovereignty, for power without visibility, for influence without rule. This template would be repeated again and again throughout history. Displaced aristocracies integrating into foreign systems. Royal bloodlines preserved through marriage rather than conquest. Sacred authority hidden beneath layers of adaptation. Once seen, this pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Even modern concepts of old families and quiet elites echo this ancient strategy. Influence exercised indirectly. Legitimacy implied rather than proclaimed. Identity preserved privately rather than publicly. The Merovingians were not naive. They understood that to challenge Rome openly would lead to annihilation. To remain visible would invite persecution. But to disappear, truly disappear, required discipline, coordination, and patience. And patience is the hallmark of dynastic thinking. Centuries mean little to a bloodline that measures time in generations rather than reigns. What is lost in one century may return in another, transformed but intact. The Merovingians, if they survived, did not need restoration. They needed continuation. This also explains why no dramatic return ever occurred. A return would have defeated the purpose. It would have exposed the bloodline to the same forces that erased it the first time. Survival meant never reclaiming the spotlight. Instead, influence could be exerted through proximity, through alliance, through memory preserved in symbols rather than names. This is why the revelation feels so unsettling. It does not offer closure. It denies the comfort of finality. If the Merovingian bloodline never ended, then history is not as settled as we believe. Legitimacy becomes fluid. Authority becomes contingent. The past is no longer safely buried. It is merely dormant. And dormancy is not death. The East, throughout this narrative, functions not as a destination, but as a mirror. It reflects what the West chose to forget. Sacred kingship, blood-based legitimacy, continuity beyond institutions. In preserving these ideas, the East inadvertently preserved the possibility of Merovingian survival. The West, in turn, mythologized what it suppressed, turning blood into legend, memory into romance, history into story. The great revelation is that story and history are not opposites. Story is often history's last refuge. When facts cannot be recorded, they are remembered symbolically. When names cannot be written, they are hinted at. When blood cannot rule, it hides. Thus, the Merovingians did not vanish into nothingness. They dissolved into the larger current of Eurasian nobility, leaving behind ripples rather than monuments. We may never identify a living descendant with certainty. That is the price of successful concealment. But certainty is not required for truth to exist. Patterns are enough. Resonances are enough. Silence, when shaped, is enough. The revelation, then, is not about proof, but about perspective. Once we accept that history can be managed, curated, and silenced, the absence of evidence becomes evidence of strategy. The Merovingian disappearance stops looking like failure and begins to resemble mastery. They lost their throne, but they kept their blood. And in the long arc of history, that may have been the wiser choice. The bloodline that never ended does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It exists as a quiet countercurrent beneath official narratives, a reminder that power does not always need a crown to survive. Sometimes survival is the ultimate victory.